going to get started now. It's straight up 12 o'clock. And we try to keep these on time. My name is Bob Thomas. We're running a webinar today. It's titled, might be startling, but will CMMC version 2.0 put you out of business? And that'll come to light as we go through the slide deck and have some discussions about this. But I think it'll be obvious. Just to give you a little background on exactly who I am and who we are. My name is Bob Thomas. I'm the Virtual Chief Information Security Officer, Chief Information Officer, and I am a Certified Information Security Manager as well here at cybersecurity. We are a full-service managed security services provider where we manage people's network from a secure standpoint, and we also perform assessments, mostly around security and compliance. Obviously, NIST 800-171 and CMMC are part of those. And probably one of the housekeeping items that I want to cover, if folks have questions, don't be bashful about asking. You can pop them in the chat box, the Q&A box. Feel free as we're going through, and we'll try to answer them in line. And if we don't have time, then we'll answer them at the end. There'll be some time set aside for Q&A as we go through this. So I thought it was probably a good point, not just to talk about the new version of CMMC, but to talk about what CMMC is. Obviously, you guys can see up there that it is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It was really invented and put together by the Department of Defense for folks that are doing business with the defense industrial base. It is, let's say, the new incarnation of NIST 800-171, or at least that has been the intent of it. It is all about trying to make sure that anybody that is providing materials and support to the defense industrial base, and obviously I'm going to use the terms DIB, Defense Industrial Base, and DoD, Department of Defense, interchangeably throughout this because they kind of mean the same thing. Obviously, the Department of Defense is at the top of the food chain, and Defense Industrial Base is everybody that works in conjunction and subscribes to their policies and procedures and provides materials for defense. They had previously announced that there was going to be a change to 1.0. The CMMC 1.0 had been in place for a couple of years, and I don't think it really got the traction that everybody was looking for. And they've got quite a bit of resistance and comments, and we're going to go through those in a minute. But the idea behind the CMMC is to create a level playing field and ensure that folks were following security guidelines in order to make sure that data and the flow of that data was being secured and had very little chance to fall into the wrong hands. I would have to say, why should you care about it? And really, we've got something up here called a business killer, and we've talked to quite a few folks about it that have been resistant, not just to CMMC, but even 800-171. And now they're being put in a position where a very large percentage of their business comes through the defense industrial base. And as part of that, they're also seeing that they are not even allowed to bid without having scored themselves on it's called SPRS. It's a supplier provider risk analysis. So you need to have been determined as eligible in order to be awarded contracts. For the moment, there are certain contracts as part of 800-171 and CMMC where you can bid the contract, but if you are awarded, you must meet their guidelines and their contractual requirements. So that's really where this comes into play. And I think a side benefit is if you become CMMC compliant and you are certified levels 1, 2, or 3, which are the new levels that exist, it will be much more likely that you'll be able to acquire cyber liability insurance and acquire it at a preferred rate. And I think that's what we're seeing out in the field more and more as time has gone on. That cyber liability rates have been skyrocketing. I talked to someone yesterday, and before they put our security program in place, their rate was quoted as double their prior rate. They had no claims, they had no specific experience that would lead you to believe that it would create a higher rate. But as quite a few carriers are leaving the environment, they are not providing that type of coverage anymore. I think it's becoming pretty obvious that as less carriers are offering this, that the premiums are going to be higher almost across the board, and specifically multiples higher if you're not really performing security first implementations for your technology. I think it's probably worthwhile looking back at exactly how CMMC has evolved from 1.0 and what the changes with 2.0 will look like. There previously were 5 different levels, and you can see through this chart, we've got very few controls, 17 at the baseline level 1, and then it very quickly escalates as you went to level 2 and level 3. I'm not going to really get into levels 4 and 5. They're meant for very large prime contractors. That's the Sikorsky's, GE, Honeywell, Northrop Grumman, those types of players. It was really meant to be up in category 5. A lot of folks would have landed in this chart between probably 2 and 3 with a smattering of 1s. I think that's pretty typical. Depends how you were interacting with data from the federal government. If you were just receiving what they call FCI, federal contract information, and not CUI, controlled unclassified information, you were probably at level 1. That was really the cutoff or the determination between the two. And then as soon as you had any interaction, whether it's creation or just access to CUI, you were immediately at level 2, and depending on if you were creating and even downstream providing to other subcontractors CUI, that immediately pushes you to level 3. So that's what the chart looked like. It was, I think it was too complicated, and I think that's what really led to the evolution to getting to version 2.0. 2.0, I know it sounds crazy and maybe even counterintuitive, but 2.0 is definitely a simplified version. And I think the federal government has, as this slide says, the first line, they actually listened at the federal government level and wanted to make compliance simpler. And at the end of the day, I really do think it is a good thing. You will see that many folks that were in the 2 and 3 category previously are at level 2, since there will only be 3 levels of the new version. This is a little bit of background on how we got to this point. There were quite a few complaints, as you can see, a little over a year ago, about exactly how the rules were being enforced or how they were projected to be enforced, and how much auditing would have to be done. They were talking about audits every year, which was fairly onerous. And then last November, they said, "Look, we're gonna make some changes. We're gonna revamp the program. We'll call it CMMC 2.0, and we're gonna restructure exactly how everyone is accountable through the security program." Their mission is make sure that you're current against threats that are evolving, make sure that you've got technology that will be able to not only catch but defend against those. How are you going to best safeguard information? Is your storage encrypted? there are certain baseline requirements, let's call them, that people really have to have in place. Otherwise, it's a failure. And there is probably one other thing. We'll explain a little bit more than this in a couple of slides coming after this, but it was a pass or fail system. There was no middle ground. There was no, if everybody's familiar with POAMs, plan of action and mitigation. There was no, we don't meet this requirement or this control today, but we're working on it. That didn't exist in 1.0. If you didn't meet the control requirement, you failed, period. And a failure was not on a sliding scale or grading curve. You failed, you failed. You needed to pass all of the requirements for the control set. So I think that was the big feedback that they had taken at the government level to say, what, we need to somehow make this a little bit more palatable and easier to understand. And that's really where they've gone with it. I think this is a really good chart that shows exactly how 2.0 is structured. And I don't think really level 1 has changed much at all. 17 controls instead of previously 15 controls. It's not a monumental change. It's for folks that are not touching, interacting with, or creating controlled unclassified information. You're dealing with federal contract information and the data contained therein. So you've got relatively modest control requirements. Yes, there is a self-assessment, which is pretty similar to how the SPRS and 800-171 is still being done today. There is no, let's say, third-party independent audit firm that's going to come in. So I do think at that level, it's fairly simple. That doesn't mean that prime contractors, I'll use Pratt & Whitney as an example. Pratt can dictate whatever they'd like for their subcontractors, so downstream providers, if you will, for security and to provide them not only a quality product, which is part of the requirement, the quality of the product, the availability of the product, the lead times, all of those things play into this, but the security of the data. And if they feel that you have to be level 2 in order to interact with them, that's their prerogative. If they want you to be 800-171 compliant, that's up to them and how strict they'd like to be with enforcing it. Similarly, we talked a little bit about previously level 2, which is really a combination of prior levels 2 and 3. You're interacting and dealing with controlled unclassified information on a regular basis with these contracts. They're very, very concerned with exactly where the data is going. Is it coming into your organization? Are you in turn handing it off to another organization because the parts that you're creating need to be heat treated? I think that's an example, a real life example, because we have clients that have that exact situation. Okay, they have to be heat treated. How much information are you providing to them? Are you giving them plan information and plan data? Those are very important things that need to be documented and tracked. And then level 3, they're expecting what are called expert level security, because we're talking about the prime contractors again. And these are the big guys that are creating the bids, creating the contracts, and asking for suppliers to provide information. So you're not going to see your everyday small manufacturer falling into level 3. They will likely be level 2. I think it's important to realize that you've got to be forthcoming with respect to these assessments that you're doing. I agree that you're not being audited every year, but it is going to come full circle. They're going to ask for self-assessments. Those assessments are going to be done on a regular, typical annual basis. And then every third year, if you're at level 2 or level 3, they're going to ask for a time to come in, audit your environment, audit the answers that you've given to those self-assessments, and not just ask, they're going to require evidence. And that's really where the rubber meets the road on all of this certification. If you can't provide the evidence, that's another problem and probably a failure at that point. You can see, and we've been talking about this a little bit as to exactly how it's evolved between 1.0 and 2.0. But at the end of the day, it is simpler. I think probably what people ought to glean from this, it really, if you're a level 2 provider, it really resembles 800-171. It is not exactly the same, but it is very, very close. It's literally a handful of controls that are different between 800-171 and CMMC version 2.0. And I think that's what you really have to look back at. Okay, when is this going to be enforced? That's July 2023. So roughly a year from now, this is going to be in place, in force, and you'll have to be meeting these guidelines. If you've been 800-171 compliant or working towards it, you're in a much better shape than starting this absolutely cold and having to start from ground zero and work your way through 110 controls. And 110 controls doesn't mean 110 items or checkboxes. Each control can have 5 or 6 categories to it that need to be met or answered to. So I think it's really smart to get out in front of this. If you've been doing 800-171, or if you've had an SPRS survey score performed and uploaded into the PIEE system, which is where the government tracks all of this, I think you're ahead of the game, and it's a good start. And I think if you haven't, you've really got to get moving on it. And I think that's really where the business killer comes into the play here. We've seen where people have spent a year and still not met their goals on being completely compliant. 800-171. So getting out in front of it is certainly a much, much bigger better way to handle it. So some of the differences for the folks that have dealt with SPRS and 800-171, I think it's obvious what the difference is. We've got accountability here because we have oversight. You've got registered professionals helping with assessing and solving problems and trying to get the right controls in place. But more importantly, at the end of the line, you've got an auditor waiting for you to come in and assess your environment. They're referred to as the number 3, PAO. It is a third-party assessing organization is what that stands for. And they will make the final determination whether they will recommend a pass or fail or certification level to the AB, the accrediting body, which is part of the Department of Defense, an organization that was created by the DoD. Now, I talked a little bit about POAMs, Plan of Action and Milestones. Some people call it milestones, some people call it mitigations. It is intended to be a short-term gap and resolution or remediation for that gap. And when I say short-term, 6 months. That's the amount of time that the government will give you to resolve a submission that says, yes, I meet all these controls, but these 2 I need more time on. And here's the time I'm asking for, and here's our plan to get that gap closed. That doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be approved. I'm using air quotes here. It's going to allow you an opportunity to make the submission, to meet the bid requirements, and ask for acceptance of that plan of action. And if they do, that's great. You'll win the bid, you'll get the contract, but then you're really under the gun to make sure that those mitigations are really put in place by the time you specified in your submission. And I think it probably goes without saying, this is aligned with National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. So we've always talked about with our Department of Defense clients that you've got to start with 800-171. A lot of people will call it DFARS. It is the starting point for getting certified. Obviously, other differences we've already talked about. It's streamlined from 5 levels of CMMC in version 1 down to 3. Level 1, all companies level 1 are just foundational. And when it says foundational, it does not mean that you have to have a specific, what's the word I'm looking for? Procedural, you need and documented policy. You've got to be able to show that the way you're performing something is repeatable based on a process that you have in place. That is one of the most important pieces of, let's just call it level 1, foundational. And then obviously we've got level 2, which will be probably the lion's share of subcontractors and providers. I think that self-assessment that you've been doing for 800-171 will carry over and be very obvious as to how the self-assessment will go with version 2.0. And then we've talked a little bit about waivers. So if you want to term waivers for POAMs, those two terms could be used interchangeably. It really depends on exactly what you're providing for the prime contractor and exactly what part that component plays in the assembly. And what I mean by that are you getting specific plan data that is related to, I'll use, common guidance systems, could be missile systems. If it's getting into that level of defense work, you could petition for a waiver. You're not going to get it. But if you're making screws that are going into a mounting plate that are going into eventually an engine assembly, 5 steps further up line, there's a chance that your waiver either will be approved or your plan of action and milestones will be approved for that 6-month window. But without these pieces in place, it's really, it is a business killer to not be able to have the ability to perform a full assessment, self-assessment, and determine how quickly can I get my gaps covered. Is it going to be quickly, 1 to 3 months, or am I going to run up against a problem? And this is what I was really referring to in the previous slide. Yes, they'll allow limited use of plan of action, but you shouldn't count on them as your crutch. You can submit them. That doesn't mean automatic approval for a bid because you said, I'm doing, out of these 17 items, I'm doing 12, and the other 5, I'm going to get to those, but I'll just say I'm going to get to them when I get to them. Well, those may be very important ones as far as securing data, and that's a definite possibility for extended risk and for a reason for them to deny. I found this really surprising, mostly because this is a difference between how 800-171 was handled and now, CMMC 2.0 enforcement, especially with auditing, but they are going to allow it on a very limited basis. And I think you can understand why. If you're, let's just say you don't have a backup and recovery plan, but you say, I'm going to have one of those in 6 months. They're providing you plan data and in order to build something. Well, if your systems go down and you don't have a way to get back up and running, they're counting on you to be able to manufacture those parts, but your systems are not available to be able to do that. you're down for, let's say, 3 weeks. We've heard of this kind of thing happening. Well, you've put someone else, another company, in a spot, in a bind, and they don't want to be in that position. So having that one item, a backup and recovery plan, written, tested, and tested annually, those are all requirements, and they're not going to budge on those. If you don't have them, that's a failure, and that's a limitation. There will be selected instances where they'll be okay with something minor not being in place immediately, but I think the real high risk items they're not going to allow. And I don't want to beat a dead horse with this. So I think most importantly, as threats evolve, your security and your program for protecting the data and your systems has to evolve. And I think that's very important to how you answer the questions in the self-assessment and explain the type of tools you're using so that they can understand, as they're scoring your submission, exactly how well you've protected your systems and the information and your staff. I think those are all very important pieces. You want to make sure that you're making decisions based on how much risk you're allowed to accept and handle, but also thinking upstream exactly how you're going to provide product to those prime contractors and every other sub in between. So just to talk a little bit about next steps and exactly how to handle CUI. I know that's probably a statement that you're all familiar with and how to deal with CUI, but there's got to be a self-assessment done. In order to qualify, you've got to have this baseline done. One of those pieces is the SPRS, supplier provider risk system. So that is something that you either have or should have done already because it was part of 800-171. So what's going to happen going forward is Department of Defense, Defense Industrial Base projects will require that this scoring be in place. If it's not in place, you won't be able to bid. That's the new rule that will be enforced. And again, enforcement for some of this is already in place, depending on the prime contractor you're dealing with. Some of them will be put in place between now and next July. But that 800-171 assessment, it really, if it hasn't been done already, that should be your first step to make sure that you're in the PIE system and you're registered and you've gone through the assessment, created a score, and it will automatically score based on the spreadsheet that the government requires and provides, and that it gets uploaded to the PIE system. So that's really, I think that's a next step if you have not done. That has got to be done. Everything else with CMMC will be based on how you answer those questions, and they will mimic a lot of the questions that get answered in the CMMC level that you're petitioning for. If you have not done this, this is another killer, mostly because they will stop you right at the bidding process. People will have bids stacking up, waiting for scoring to be done. Work with their IT providing team. Have they scored high enough in order to accept bids and reply to them? This is a really, really big deal. If you haven't paid attention to this, this is one that definitely needs your attention and needs it now. And it really goes back to my earlier comment about how long is it going to take really to get to the end of the line, to where I am quote unquote compliant as close to compliant with POEMs as I need to be in order to bid projects, accept awarded contracts, because that's really where it's going to stop. Some of the things, this is kind of interesting because this is an approach that we use here at Kyber. We've got, and it's 6 steps. And that's just how we laid it out. That's not based on anybody's program. This is the way we've developed our program to try to help folks. And you can see that, we initially go through a discovery phase. Can't really assess until we understand an environment. And you go through an assessment process. We've got a tool that we have that we use every day that assesses 800-171, 800-171A, which is the newest version, CMMC 1.0, 2.0, which will be out next week. They are releasing the 2.0 version for our tool that we use. We've got folks that are on HIPAA for healthcare. So we assess all kinds of organizations, but until you do, real discovery and understand a client, I don't think you can do that. Do the assessment. The information that comes out of the assessment, there's some good, there's some bad. It's just the way they are, and there will be gaps. How do you deal with the gaps? That's where we come up with recommendations. So we have a gap chart that says, here's every item that does not meet the control, and then how are we going to remediate those and make recommendations, apply timelines, apply budgets, and then come up with a plan on exactly what the timeline is that maybe meets your requirements, meets your budgeting. It's a formula for trying to get to the gap remediation as quickly as possible, but being reasonable about it. And then implementation. Start implementing those remediation plans, and what maybe that's creating, writing, and testing a backup and disaster recovery plan, an incident response plan. Maybe it's about policies. There's the policies that are required throughout these assessments and the guidelines associated with CMMC are dozens. And those policies, it's just not something in writing. You actually have to figure out a way to enforce those and apply those controls in your system. So it's very easy to say everybody's going to use multi-factor authentication, which is great. We use it every day, and we employ every single client of ours to use it every day. Okay, how are you going to do it? What pieces of the environment is it going to protect? Is it available in every tool that you use? Some software providers have not written it into their code yet. So all these things have to be considered when you're trying to go through not just the assessment process, but how am I going to remediate any gaps that are uncovered? And I think that's a really important thing to understand. And we wrote the process so that we do it in a structured and what I would call a predictable way. And I know I'm sounding a bit like a broken record here, but it never happens overnight. Budgets have to be taken into consideration. Do you have to re-budget because the budget you wrote 6 months ago didn't account for this? Okay, somebody's going to have to approve that. And when we say it can take up to a year, up to is a nice way of putting it. It could take longer than a year, depending on where you are today. Somebody says, "Oh, I'm still running Windows 2003 server." Why are you doing that? Well, the application that runs on it was never developed for anything newer. Did you find a new application? And we did, but we didn't get it rolled out yet. We haven't had enough time to implement. Okay, priorities have to change, and I think that's one of the things that this timeline of, let's call it 1 year, because that's really when enforcement is going to take place, a year from now. It gives you time to do stuff, but a year passes pretty quickly, and so certainly in technology terms, and we see this a lot. We talk to a lot of different folks of a lot of different sizes, and I think the most important thing is to try to get out in front of it, and if nothing else, get an assessment done. When you get that assessment done, you'll at least know where you stand and what hurdles you have out in front of you. I've got, an offer, but I want to talk about questions. If there's some folks that have questions, if anything's come up, I can certainly answer those on the fly. If there's others that people want to submit, I can certainly one-on-one answer questions, but I'm available to do that.
Hey, Bob, I see a question here. Someone asking if they can do that self-assessment truly themselves, or if that's something that's going to require some sort of outside help or an IT provider or internal IT person.
So I think the answer is, if you don't have a really firm grasp of the technology that's in use, not just from an application standpoint, you use, QuickBooks, Sage, use any of the, Job Boss, Epicor. This is not just about application level. This is, do you know what operating systems are running? Do you know what patch level you're running? Do you know what type of firewall and what firmware's on it? How is your network structured? There's a lot of nitty-gritty pieces that have to be answered as part of that self-assessment. I don't want to blanket say there's no way you can do it, but you definitely have to have a technical background. But I think having really good documentation and an understanding of the environment is critical too. I don't know if that's the nice answer, or a nice way of saying it's probably difficult to do unless you have an IT department.
And I think as a follow-up to that, can I answer the questions to the best of my ability? And if I'm not 100% accurate in that, is that defensible, or what's the situation if I answer them to the best of my knowledge when I fill out the self-assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a dangerous place. I don't think you can stand behind I didn't know. I think if you answer the question, you need to be able to support it when they ask for evidence, because that's really what's going to happen as this, as time goes by. The self-assessment, albeit maybe accurate, as soon as an audit is done, they're going to stop you in your tracks and say, okay, well, you answered this. I can't come up with an example right off the top of my head, but you answered this as, yes, you have. You're doing logging of, I'm trying to come up with one, of all your systems and retaining those logs. And there's a certain retention that's required. You could answer yes to that because maybe you're aware that the equipment that you have in place has logging capability. You may not be aware that those logs are overwritten every 24 to 48 hours because there's no long-term storage capabilities in a lot of equipment. And I don't mean desktops and servers. I'm really speaking of network infrastructure equipment, switches, Wi-Fi, routers, firewalls, those types of components. And you would say, well, I answered the question, yes. Yeah, but it requires that you have a minimum of 90 days of retention. Show me the logs. And that would be a deal breaker there, because they're going to ask for evidence. And if you can't provide the evidence, it's that's not answered properly. So I think that's really where it's important. We've had clients, and we do this pretty regularly. They will fill out either their portion that they're comfortable with, and a lot of it may be about physical plant information. Access is a perfect one. And when I mean access, I don't mean necessarily server access or computer access, but physical access to the site. Do they have access control? Do they have logging for who comes and who goes? How is that being monitored? How's it being controlled? Is it with badges or proximity devices, tokens, however it's being controlled? They will answer all of those types of questions because typically they implemented or had it installed for them and they know all about it and make the changes to that system. But other technology they won't be aware of. They forward that to us and then we help them with that piece. And that's, I would say that's more common than anything. Now, we did one with a client of ours with GE. GE had maybe they had 55 questions that they wanted asked and answered on one of their assessments. The client did 20 of them, 18, and then they sent them to us. We answered probably 30 of the remaining and then sent back. You know, we're both essentially working off the same portal that GE gives us access to. Said, you know what? I need you to answer 31, 37, and 52. We don't have the information on you guys because we didn't implement that. And maybe it's a conversation, maybe it's a meeting, a Teams meeting, and we go through those. But I think that's probably in the small to mid-sized business world, the most likely avenue to getting these completed. Got anything else, Mike?
One here, I don't know how you're going to answer this, but how long does it take to do the self-assessment? And do you get to look at it ahead of time to figure out what, you know, how you need to answer or what things you can do before you do the assessment?
So the assessments that we've been doing, I'll call it the run through, without advanced, I mean, we have advanced knowledge because we do them every, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 a week, but without the end user being aware of the questions that are coming at them, it's typically 2 hours start to finish to go through every question. Sometimes it requires explanation, and it's probably part of how we're able to help is to take the jargon out of it and help ask the question in real life terms, in real English, so that people are trying to really get their arms around the question without trying to dissect exactly what's being asked. We do that dissection and we say, by endpoint protection, they really mean, do you have an advanced antivirus program? Is it being constantly updated? Does it automatically scan every time you insert a USB drive in it? Do you have capability of blocking USB drives? Those types of things we understand and we know because we understand the controls that the government is asking for. So we're able to, let's say, accelerate and get through things. The reporting that comes out of it, we've got to look at the gaps that come out of that report. Usually takes, I don't know, 2 to 5, 6 hours to understand exactly where the gaps are, what type of treatments are necessary. So there's a bit of a process, but if you're just talking about trying to get through the Q&A, it's typically 2 hours. I think that's a safe number to get the answers to the questions.
I do not have any other questions that I see in the chat here.
No problem. So one of the things that, as part of going through and putting the presentation together, we thought maybe it would be helpful for folks to be able to understand from, a high level, but I think a meaningful level, exactly what the government is looking for and what we see every day as common problems. And, we can probably, take 15 minutes of someone's time and help them through these 10 common, we built let's call it a mini assessment to say, okay, let's get on the phone, we'll have a conversation, we'll go through, we'll ask you these top 10 items that we know for a fact are must-haves. And do you have them in place? Do you think you have them in place? Do you think you have most of them in place, but these others you've been avoiding because they're big, hairy items that just are you know they're going to take time and money to be able to solve, so they've been set to the side. So we created this this quick assessment guideline that talks about these roadblocks, and there's that whole business killer thing that was splashing up on the screen. This will speak to those items to say, do you have a backup and recovery system? Is it encrypted? And is there an offsite copy of the data in addition to an on-site copy? And is it encrypted, getting it from place to place, from on-site to off-site? And then, it goes, we can talk about, does it get tested? How often does it get tested? How do you know it works? There's a lot that goes along with that, but that's a typical one. That's a deal breaker if it's not in place. So that's part of one of those items that we've got in this most common roadblocks. And you can sign up. You can click there. I think we can post it in the chat, or you can email it to us. And
I just put in the chat that if anybody is interested in this, you can either just say so in the chat, or you can sign up by sending an email to marketing@cybersecurity.com.
There you go. No problem. So that's a really easy way to understand, am I going to have a problem? And this is not a level 2 thing. We've got roadblock items in here that pertain to level 1 as well. So just because you're not dealing with CUI doesn't mean that it doesn't apply. There are still controls. If you're not using a supported operating system, it's a big deal, really big deal. That's probably a showstopper.
So for those of you who have replied in the chat, someone will get back to you in the next day or so to set up a time to do your initial gap assessment. And again, anyone who wants to send an email to marketing@cybersecurity.com, same response on that.
Great. Excellent. Mike, thanks very much. I appreciate you jumping in. And folks that are on the line, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Cybersecurity is focused on the DoD market and small manufacturers. So we're trying to help in that realm, especially. We feel comfortable because we've got time still to be able to help people not just assess, but resolve and remediate issues. And that really helps out and makes us feel good and like we can make a difference. Folks, thanks very much. You can see our contact information there. We'll leave that up, and everybody's going to get a copy of the slide deck in PDF form. So if you had any questions or there was something that you wanted to look at, it'll go out to every one of the attendees. Folks, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully we'll be talking to you.